Azkuna zentruaren izenean beste behin
On behalf of the Azkuna Center, good evening once again and welcome to this Gutun Zuria festival.
Gaurko honetan Bernardo Atxaga idazlea eta Oskar.
Today we're going to have the writer Bernardo Atxaga and the journalist Oskar Alegria. And it's true that literature and narrative and the audiovisual are going to be the subjects they're going to be talking about through experience in photography, in writing, etc. Gutun Zuria has invited us to these excellent meetings, and those that can't come to the auditoria can follow it on the internet, although obviously it's a pleasure for us to have you here. I remind you that at 9 o'clock there will also be a book signing in the literary corner. And you also can follow the simultaneous translation. Although Bernardo Atxaga needs no introduction, but he does deserve it. He has worked in several areas on radio, but above all writing from the 80s. And he's still fully dedicated to literature. And we've also seen his work on the big screen. And we obviously have to mention Obamakwa because it's a reference and a benchmark. He's written stories, scripts, children's literature, etc., etc. And Oskar Alegria, journalist, had a photography artistic project called Visible Cities, and he's a writer, photographer, etc. And he's a director of the Pamplona International Photography Festival. His first feature film was Awakya, and now we're going to receive them with a round of applause. This is Gutun Zuria.
Arratsaldeon eta
good evening. Good evening, and thank you for coming to listen to us, for wanting to listen to us. We hope what we have to say will be interesting. Oskar Alegria and I have often discussed this and that. And you know that the subject we have today is the relationship between literature and other forms of art. And I'm going to begin because time is relentless, and even more so now in this Azkuna Center. Regarding that relationship, regarding the relationship between the various forms of art, the first thing that has to be said is that all muses are sisters. In other words, all forms of art have a close relationship with each other. And theater, poetry, everything in history, painting, everything is related. And in this case, I should say that during the time of the Greek muses, there was no cinema, but the cinema muse is also a sister. And in saying this, I remember all authors. In my opinion, all authors have inside a core. And from that core, in my opinion, all their work comes out. And that core, in my opinion, always remains attached to the person, and it's there from childhood. It seems like an ordinary idea, and that's why I would like to explain it through three cases. The first case is Miles Davis, trumpeter, jazz musician. I read Miles Davis's biography, and I've read a number of writings by him. And in one of them, he says that all his music, his way of making music, his way of playing the trumpet, the sound, we would say, comes from an impression from his childhood where in Arkansas, in his native city, he used to go with his grandmother to a Baptist church, but the church wasn't close to where he lived. It was a long way from where he lived, and they used to walk there. And apparently it was very windy there. And he said that he was influenced by the music and the singing from the church as they approached, men, women, children in a choir, and the wind carried the music and mixed it up. And he says, all my music comes from that impression from my childhood. I mentioned music, but another muse, the muse of poetry. There are many people I could quote, and I've chosen Winston Auden, an English poet. And in his biography, I also read that he wrote poetry the way he did because in his childhood, you know what hoes are? Hoes that are used in farming because of the experience he had with two hoes. He said there was a kind of mine or some abandoned land near his home, and his father gave him two hoes. One was very small, very beautiful, with a red handle. A wonderful, very sharp hoe, and the other one was an old hoe. It had been used for a long time, and he said for many years he played with the beautiful hoe, but as time went by, he realized that the old, ugly hoe was much better for the job. And he said later, when he started to write poetry, he often thought that we won't get anywhere with beautiful words, and the same way we won't get anywhere with the beautiful hoe. And sometimes he had to use old, ugly words, etc. So there again is a core that stems from childhood. And moving on to more contemporary times and taking my own experience, Oteiza's confession is very obvious in this sense. What does Oteiza tell us? That his sculpture and his understanding of the world, all his reflections on art, come from an experience he had on the beach at Orio. Apparently, on the beach, Oteiza used to dig big holes in the sand, and then he used to climb into the hole that he dug. And when he climbed into the hole, everything around him disappeared. He couldn't see people from the hole. He couldn't see the sunshades. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't see the mountains. He could only see the sky above. And he said from that void, looking up, he thought that that was a metaphor on the evolution of art. And then when he grew older, he felt that art was a matter of bringing in everything that had been left outside, the people, the sunshades, the mountains, and paintings and sculptures started to become empty. And his last sculptures were empty spaces, and he connected this with the Basque cromlechs, as you know, because it seemed to him that the Neolithic period, well, that people here did the same things here. First, they covered the walls of the caves with bison, with horses, with outside life. But at a given point in time, they built that cromlechs. And that cromlechs, for him, was like the void in the hole he dug when he was a child on Odio Beach, where there was only the emptiness of the sky. So, in my opinion, childhood impressions put us on the road to poetry, to sculpture, to cinema, to theatre. That, for me, is the core, the engine. And some continue along that path, and others decide not to. They decide they prefer a different life, and they don't continue on that path. But I think that we all have a core. In other words, muses love us in general. And that's the way I think. And Oskar Alegria has put this book in front of me, and I know that Oskar Alegria, who read all Oteiza's books and took notes and thought a lot about it. And I think that you talk about Oteiza's glasses as an expression of that core. So let's get on with it then. Yes, thank you very much. You said that muses are sisters, and I would say they're twins. This is my book. As Umbral used to say, I've come here to talk about my book. Because it's not really my book. How can I say it? It's not Oteiza's book either. He wrote it, but he didn't publish it. Because the core of the book are the notes he took. He used to read a great deal. He had 10,000 books in his library. And they're all underlined, full of notes, comments. And in doing this work on Oteiza, on the Marginalia of Oteiza, and I learned that that's investigation on those notes in the margin. This is by Edgar Allan Poe, a little essay translated by Cortázar, a book on Marginalia. And Edgar Allan Poe defends Marginalia because he says that they are ideas without affectation. And he felt that that Oteiza in these pages is a very free, pure, natural Oteiza. His ideas are ideas of mud, of clay. They are ideas that are in the waiting room of thought. They haven't been disseminated yet through the mental process, through the brain. They are notes that appear in isolation. Therefore, they don't form an elaborate discourse. They're just a sketch. And that's where the genius of some artists lie, in that sketch. And it can be said that they are also Oteiza's muses, because thanks to this work, we can learn about Oteiza's sources, where he got his ideas from. There's a book by Borges, for example, that talks about time, the passage of time, and Oteiza is always in that debate with Borges. And there's the center of the page, but there's a debate on the margins of the page, and you have to be quick, and you have to move away from the center of the page. That's where those ideas are. And Borges is always talking about time, but Oteiza corrects him and says, you're talking about time, but I only see space. You're talking about time. In that place where you put time, I see space. A red book, like Mao Zedong's book, a revolutionary book. And it's not just any red. This book was designed with Santos Bregaña. And they did research into Oteiza's last portraits to find out exactly what color red Oteiza's scarf was. And that's banal, the fact that this cover and his scarf have the same color, because after all, they have the same function, to protect the core against the enemy, against cold, against time. And how did Oteiza used to read? Well, to show it, we can see Oteiza here in this first picture in his studio. And it's been a privilege I've had in working on this book, because I've been able to look about his study, look at his desk, look at his things. And I realized that Oteiza always read with a pen in his hand. In other words, he was a reader-writer, and always with 2 pairs of glasses. Here we can see the beauty of the ritual. Also a cigarette in the other hand, his other reading instrument. And these are his spectacle cases, the first, with the legend "Read" in green, and the second one says "Far Away." But imagine what was inside these cases, the gaze of our artist. And this takes me to a way of defining Oteiza. Oteiza was a man with 2 pairs of glasses, an artist with 8 eyes. And he used these glasses in exactly the opposite way, and I'll explain. For example, he didn't use reading glasses and that way he was capable of reading not just what's between the lines, but what's beyond the lines, and also the opposite. What was in the open horizon, in that distant landscape, to look at those, he used his reading glasses, and therefore he could see the little details that were significant, things that we can't see. He could see them. 3 examples. Here, with our ordinary glasses, what we see are another 2 sisters, another 2 muses that are near Irurzun. They are 2 rocks that are called the 2 sisters, and Oteiza, with his reading glasses, what he saw was the emptiness, the void between those 2 rocks. In the old place names, the translation would be something like the gap between the rocks. And that was exactly what Oteiza saw. That gap, that space between the rocks, that void that Oteiza said, a void that we can fill in. Another example, this is a horse between Usturiz and Osozelaya. They're underground paintings, and we can see the strokes, but Oteiza, with his special gaze, he saw a line, a specific line, the line that runs through the skull of the horse. And for him, that was the bridle. And that meant that human beings 20,000 years ago were capable of breaking a wild animal before they did in Mongolia. In other words, he was capable of seeing this with his special glasses. What do we have here? The moon, right? The moon, which in Basque is called the light of the dead. But Oteiza, with those reading glasses, what he saw was a moon in movement. And he used a combination of Basque words and European words to describe it. And finally, Oteiza's gaze was an accurate and extensive gaze at the same time, even though it sounds like a paradox. And as I said, he was an artist with 8 eyes. And to hand the floor over to Bernardo, at the beginning you mentioned 3 figures and 3 sparks. Yes, a kind of flame. Where does that creative impulse come from? Because I've read different versions. What was that spark that produced that creative impulse in you? Well, if you like, I can help you a little bit with Oteiza. I suppose many of you know about it, but it's an anecdote I enjoy, and it's always okay to repeat an anecdote. And regarding Oteiza's core, above all, he played with the paradox, and there's a very clear example of this. I don't know whether you know that he did the Arantzazu apostles, and instead of making 12, he made 14. And he always said that he didn't make more because there wasn't enough room. And he put them up. And in those days, in the early 60s, it may even have been as early as 1955. Yes, it may have been in 1955. And when the representatives from the church, and think about the period, when they saw 14 apostles with those gaps and those indentations, they felt, well, these apostles should be left here. But left here, by left here, they meant by the roadside. And they were there for a long time, 15 years. And Oteiza had to put up with a lot of mockery, insults. And I don't know whether you know this story, but an intellectual from the period said, Oteiza, I can't understand how you've made these apostles with looking this way, with that stone full of voids.
He said that, well, all the farmers, the Basque farmers, would come to Arantzazu, would see the apostles, and they would say, these are the rocks, the stones that I have in my farm. This can't be that way. So this is why he always had the right answer. If we knew him, we knew he always had the right answer. And he would answer, yes, but when that Basque farmer would go back to his farm and look at his stones, he would say, well, I didn't know these rocks and stones were the apostles. So, well, that's a different gaze, a different way to look at things, and that's a paradox. Maybe we're talking too fast. And you were asking me about that kind of a spark. I had a teacher, Jose Maria Valverde. He was a teacher of aesthetics and a poet. And he used to tell me, well, it's very good that you adapt this life of a writer, because others, they start talking and they do not even let others talk. And you writers, they give you a microphone and you're quite good at talking. That's a good profession. And so I seize this occasion to talk about my experience. And I think sometimes we don't acknowledge some things because of our ideologies, but our life here in the Basque country, people who are 45, 65, they had a fundamental home in every church, in every village that was the church. And I'm talking about the church, not about religion. That's something else. Some other day we could talk about religion if you want, but I'm talking about the building itself of a church. And since you were, since we all were children, I really like to walk on the mat and to walk through paths. I didn't come from a farm, but I would love to go to my friends' stables, and then from there go and see everything really spotlessly clean in a church, and everything well waxed and shiny. So I was very shocked by that. Then there was this smell of the incense, and I'm going to conclude shortly. And to me, a fundamental experience, because at the time, Mass was in Latin. And when I used to go to Mass, it used to be in Latin. And we would pray our Father in Latin. And he's saying it's in Latin now. And do you know it in Basque? Well, don't ask me those difficult questions, please. Well, so imagine that more than 50 years ago, this happened. I'm not praying in Latin every day, but I still have it in my mind. I can still tell the Our Father in Latin. So I remember how I was really impressed by all this preaching in Latin. And he goes in Latin. When they started in this way, I would wonder what means Domus Aurea. Well, the golden house. And to me, that was an image. If I previously said that the church to me was a perfectly clean, shiny place, well, then Latin to me was an additional foreign language. We only spoke Basque, and to us, Latin was a language we thought we understood, because mater was like mother, or pater like father, or domus maybe, if we had done some Latin at the school. But it was a language that we understood, but at the same time we didn't really understand. And then there was that space in between that was linked to flowers, to the incense. And I think writing poetry is very much related to that something else, to that other world. It is not another planet, but another universe, something different that cannot be defined, that cannot be turned into something precise. You try to approach it and somehow collect that impression from your childhood, and then put it into a poem in your language, in the language you use. And I briefly would like to say that time later I realized how important, and you're going to say religion again, but I mean, I remember those cards with Giotto, with Filippo Lippi. I remember those faraway landscapes that we would see in those cards and illustrations, like the Samarkand Tower. And that also, of course, caused, I mean, that of course was very impressive to me. And here we had more hatchets than golden things. But to me, Latin was something that was like that hatchet by Odin, or the void by Oteiza, or the wind by Miles Davis. Of course, they were better, but just for me, for you to understand me. So it's that same feeling, that same core. Well, my turn. Yes, it is your turn. Yes, because I know you've been doing a film, and I remember that once you told me that Basque language was what Latin was to me, I think. Yes, because you were born somewhere where Basque was not spoken. Yes, I was born in Estella, and the landscape of Giotto is there. It exists. And in my childhood, my grandmother had like a cabin by the river, far away from the church, and she was called Dionysia Socrates. And I always used to say that in my family we were post Socrates. And I closed these parentheses, or these brackets. And this is where we spend summertime. And our lizards used to live there. And there we had that mysterious riverside where a man used to live in solitude. And he spent many years there without any roads around, without electricity, without current water. And from our river side, we would see that man. And whenever he saw us, he would run away and go and hide. And he spoke Basque. And I had an uncle from the Imot Valley. And they used to be, each of them, in a river, in one of the riversides or riverbanks, and they would talk to each other in Basque from bank to bank. And I was fascinated by Basque. Of course, I saw that mysterious man coming out of a forest, and a fox would walk by him, and then he would start talking in Basque with my uncle without shouting, in a very sort of quiet way. And I would ask my father, what are they talking about? Well, they're talking about the cows. And I remember I used to think, is this a language to talk about cows? You know, when I was a child, I just thought that could be it. Maybe this is language to talk to cows, and I simply didn't speak the language. And that language was that kind of a river over the two river banks. So to me, that was really this spark that sort of started that language in me. And to me, it was like Latin for you. It was something else, something additional, something sophisticated. And my uncle, that was older than the man at the other river bank, he died earlier. We're talking of a time when you would not wear a watch. And your time reference would come from the Psalm, the Sun, the Angelus. And one day, my uncle didn't show up, and the other man did come, but my uncle didn't come back again, or either the day after. And that night, he went to bed in real solitude, because he thought, that's it. The last speaker is not the last speaker, but the one before the last one, because the last before the last one is does no longer have a chance to talk to anybody else either. So I would like to know what really went through his mind that night, what was in his mind that very last night, when he knew he was the penultimate man to speak the language. Well, I'm going to say something silly now, says Bernardo. I always remember the following. It seems Napoleon was asked how was it possible that soldiers before a battle, knowing that maybe half of them would die, how could they sleep? Why do they sleep, your soldiers? And it seems Napoleon answered, well, they sleep because they're usually very tired. So maybe if you remove poetry for me, that's what you have left. Maybe this was not your case, but yes, I think that was the end of a certain universe. So glasses, you have glasses. How do you use your glasses from your point of view? After that first impression that I got in my childhood, maybe this became a habit. And then you go to school or to high school, and you like morning classes in the morning because it is biology or chemistry, but then in the afternoon it is religion and literature, and those are the ones that you really like, especially the literature class. So it is usually that you have to attend the humanities or later, humanities classes in the afternoon when it is siesta time. So when you're with your glasses, you see some things and others you don't see them. So I've got to say that I read yesterday that is now the centenary of a very well-known poet, Italian poet. And he's got some poems titled The Infinite. And I could tell you many things, but I don't know what to say, really. And this is Gutun Zuria. Everything goes here. And since I started with some silly things, I'm going to tell you a real silly thing. So sometimes you have a tendency or you have a habit and you want to go on with it. And no matter how, I remember that in that school of mine, in literature class, we used to write an essay, and on Friday you would read it out loud. So you had to copy something like a cat got into a kitchen, and then so we had to come on Monday with what he had said, well written down, and then we will get a 10. But I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be somebody else, somebody special, I wouldn't pay attention. So I would write an essay on my cat. And then all my friends will get a 10, and I would only get a 5. And I didn't like it, because I was the official poet amongst my friends. And then suddenly, he said, you should write about a storm. And it happened that in the Andoine library, I was reading for the first time the Aeneid. And it started with a storm, so I took it and I copied the first 12 pages. I've got to confess that my teacher was a bit sensitive, because he gave a 10 to all my friends, and to Virgil's, he only gave Virgil's a 6. I'm only telling you these to show how sometimes you have a tendency or a habit, and it gets to be very wild, and you don't want to know about anything else, and then you sort of end up hitting yourself against every corner. You also read books in a different way. You underline some lines and some books according to your habits. I know you also like butterflies. And I read Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry. And then once I was done with it, I had a look at everything that I had underlined, and there were 2 sentences. The author said, Oscar Wilde in Victoria Station, surrounded by policemen, and he's handcuffed. And it was very sad. And then I thought of butterflies flying towards the ocean. And I guess at the time I was only 20. So some years later, I wrote some lyrics for the Basque group Deutsch. I started saying, butterfly flying towards the ocean, don't go, don't go. So that line that I underlined at Malcolm Lowry's text sort of reappeared when I was making these lyrics. So, you know, it's a tendency. You tend to see some things, and others you don't see them, and with those that you see, you make your own poem. So, butterflies. I think you should talk about butterflies. It's a very nice subject. Well, Oskar says this is about talking about the last night, because butterflies are disappearing. So, like some words. A century ago, somebody came to draw the map of the Basque language and the words in Basque language, and they found many different words to say butterfly. And it's always said that among Eskimos there are 20 words to say white, or in Gaelic or Galician for the rain. It is clear, because for an Eskimo, everything is white around him or her, and same goes for somebody in Galicia. There's always rain. But why so many words to name butterflies? And I am looking for questions, not for answers. And what I am trying to do is, out of those 117 butterflies, try to know how many are still alive. I don't usually write, others write for me, but this is kind of a calligraphic way now. This is another art that is about to disappear. We no longer write, and calligraphy was an art. And it's like the portrait of somebody. There you see the age. Whether somebody is an optimistic or not, and what school they attended. Depending on how people write. So then I followed another rule, and I said, I would like to do normative work, and Bonaparte worked with 14 witnesses. Many of them were priests. Most of them were priests. And I am trying to do my research in a different way without taking into account the church, because often research on our language has always been done through the church. So here we have Jinkoyoren Oyua. This is like the God's chicken or hen. So I try to see the parallel in between a grain and that letter. So word is alive in a river, and in next river there's a new word. So this chicken or this god, chicken or hen, always appears with this wording. In one of the Basque farms I found a different official way to classify butterflies. Where do you find a butterfly, what day, at what height? And my intention is to cut that word and with a pin to stick it in a map where you find the butterfly, because words are like butterfly, Jinka, Yoren, Oyua, so God's a chicken. That word is going to go away. And in this work, I went to from Pamplona to that very old farm in the Bastan. And she wrote the word, and I was just sort of packing and about to leave. And may I ask you a question? And I knew what she was going to ask me. Did you come all the way from Pamplona just to find this word? And I say yes. So I see how in some places they neglect their language. And my first gift with this job is a gift to them, so they know that the whole universe is about them. You are the only person in the world that knows about this world. So now, today you can go to bed thinking that Jinkora Yen Ojoa, it is still said, because you say it, only you say it. Chichi Papa, as you see it on the screen. So the word is the portrait of the person. This comes from Lesaca in Vera, the region of Vera. This comes from Ababacoac. So the word has also soul, and the husband, and Timirika is the wife. They were 4 kilometers away, in between their two farms, Timirika, Bichirika. So for my mom, it was Timeleta, Micheleta, but one day they met. And when I went there with my car, I know what they're going to ask me. I was guessing in what festivity these two butterflies meet. they met in the factory of Michelin. So nothing romantic. And there starts another story. You go to a farm with the excuse that is to talk about a butterfly, but then you end up talking about tires, because this man, he used to work in the production line of Michelin. And then the wife, she would work in section 3, but that was how they got to meet each other. And in between their two areas of work, there was an area called secret. What does it mean? Well, nobody knew. Everybody came and visited the production line, but the secret, like in the Coke, nobody knows what the secret is. So I went back to Pamplona thinking that what they had in between them was a secret. And to finish, Chilipitania. We are in the Biscay region, in Larrabechu, Chilipitania. Libe Asua used to use this word for 102 years. Oh, lucky lady that she lived so long, Bernardo says. And during my visit, I witnessed what she would eat. And then I thought, well, this is the magic formula. I would like to eat what she eats. And she was eating everything a doctor would tell you not to eat. So in the other face, in the other side of the chimeleta, I would write the recipe for that food, like 3 spoonfuls of colacao, 2 glasses of milk, and 2 spoons of sugar. And there we see this lady, Libe, having breakfast.
Erran dugun bezala, maleruski Txilipitania otsailean.
Unfortunately, Chilipitania died last February. Rest in peace. You're right. You say that you started with these 2 people from Asteatsu, some neighbors of mine from my village, and you started talking about Chimirrica, and you ended up talking about tires. Well, maybe, you know, this is very much related to the character of butterflies, because if I am not wrong, and if they did not lie to me when I went to school, in the ancient Greece, it was thought that the journey of our thinking would be erratic, without a direction, as butterflies fly, also like birds sometimes, and that was your psyche. And then you would go here and there. And my dear Gabriel Aresti, the poet, when Ricardo Arregui died in an accident, it was a terrible day, a terrible accident, because Ricardo Arregui, he was the most dynamic man in Basque culture at the time. And so he got killed when he was on his way to visit Gabriel Aresti. And this was a great shock for Gabriel Aresti. And in his funeral is when I saw Gabriel Aresti for the first time. And he read a poem titled The Death of Ricardo Arregui. And when he told this poem, he was crying. And he mentioned many butterflies, and also Haiko Yo. And he talks about Chola Choleta, about 1,000 black butterflies, and he mentions all this in his poem. That's what I was thinking about when you were talking about butterfly, and this was not in our script, by the way. And I think I'm going to loop the loop, because we started talking about art and about literature and painting. Some years ago, somewhere near Bilbao, I went to see an exhibition by Dionisio Blanco. Dionisio Blanco used to produce very clear paintings. He was very sort of engaged, and he would represent at the time as he could all these killings in the Civil War and executions. And there, I realized that in a corner, in a painting, there was something written down. So I approached the painting, and I used to know Aresti and his style. And what I could read there is, "They will call me." And I realized this is a poem by Blas de Otero. And it was very special. Dionisio Blanco wants to paint a painting on these executions. And he did the execution, but he didn't want to leave any voids, because maybe people would say, an execution, why? So he wanted to write something else. He wanted to add that poem by his friend Blas de Otero, because it was clear that it was a poem on the executions and the shootings, and it is like, they will call me, they will call you. So he wanted to write that, but he didn't dare really doing that. So he thought, if I write this in Spanish, then the police would realize about it. And then he went to see Otero, and Otero said, I've got a friend, Gabriel Otero. He writes very well in Basque, so maybe he could translate it for you. And then at the time, there were no policemen that could read the Basque. So unfortunately, that painting was not part of the catalog. So he didn't realize, the one doing the catalog, to include it. And I don't know where it is now. It is lost, but it does exist, because I did copy that poem myself. I wrote it myself. So sometimes, you know, art and poetry sort of collide and converge. And this is what Dionisio did. As you see in the butterflies, they fly, and time also flies here. And I think now we have to give the floor to the audience. We cannot see them. So enjoy that you are anonymous. Enjoy the darkness,
But
Yes, are there any questions? Any questions? It's usually very difficult to ask questions from there. There are microphones in the room.
bukatzeko nik egingo dizut, azkena.
Bueno.
Zimeletari
Well, I'll ask a final question to finish with butterflies. You've discovered an author for me, Robert Caillou. And I bought a book with the title Stones. Yes, the Caillou, there's a school. And the question they ask is whether nature speaks to us directly. If nature can make art, the answer is probably no. But he analyzes the shapes of stone as if there was will behind it. And I think that to believe in that, you have to believe in God. Otherwise, it's difficult. So he believes that there's also a language in nature and that it's an artistic language and not just in stones. He mentions butterflies, and in particular night butterflies, because night butterflies, if you've seen them, when they open their wings, if you see them from behind, they have shapes with the form of eyes, and they look like a skull or a face. And apparently, the birds that eat butterflies, when they seen them with their wings open and that look like eyes, they think that the animal is bigger than it is, that it's not just a butterfly, it's a bigger animal. And the same thing happens with the peacock with that tail. And the aggressor thinks it's a big animal. So the question that Caillou asks is there writing in nature, or what is this? Well, very often you can read a book, there are many here behind me, and you let your imagination fly. And you try to follow your internal butterfly, but it's very interesting. Didn't Odeitha have any Caillou books? I don't know what he would have thought. He'd probably wouldn't agree. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you and goodbye.
Eskerrik asko. Hurrengo arte. Aur.
See you next time. Goodbye.